I want to begin today by, of course, recognizing our veterans and thanking all the men and women who serve and have served this country. I want to especially thank those who gave their lives for the freedoms we take for granted. I want to thank those who sacrificed mightily, both physically and emotionally, but are still with us. I want to thank the young men and women who are serving our country overseas. If any of you have ever been to one of our bases overseas, you will understand that their jobs sometimes are thankless and lonely. We owe our veterans everything. I don't know why the world is like this, but there are evil people in the world, and you can't reason with them. Weakness invites the wolves, and America has remained free in part because we cherish our values ourselves and respect them, even in difficult times, and because we have the strongest military in all of human history. And I know you join me in those sentiments. Well, I want to talk about three topics quickly today. The first topic I want to cover, it's not the sexiest of topics, but it is enormously important. As you know, Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution requires a census. And we are about to start our census. We're going to spend about $15 billion of your money trying to get it right. For the first time, Americans will be able to respond to the census online. And we hope many people will do that. It's certainly the least expensive and most convenient way. You can, of course, respond by mail. The folks we have hired to help us with the census this year have been equipped with special iPhones with special apps so they can get assignments in real time and try to go visit with people that for whatever reason choose not to fill out the census. The census, as I say, it's not the most exciting topic in the world, but it has huge political ramifications, huge social ramifications, and huge economic ramifications. We have about 325 federal programs that spend about $900 billion, that's B as in billion, 9 zeros, a year, sending money to states and in respective groups. And it's all based on population. We haven't done the census, of course. We're starting it, but a number of experts have taken a look at demographic trends in our country. Louisiana is not expected to gain a congressional seat, but we're not going to lose a congressional seat either. But there are going to be a lot of other changes. There's an expectation that Texas and Florida will probably each gain 3 congressional seats. Montana, Oregon, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina will probably gain 2 congressional seats. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. If you look at those who will lose, there are a couple of states on the bubble that may or may not lose a congressional seat. One is California, the other one is Minnesota. In the likely, very likely to lose a congressional seat are Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and this one was a surprise to me, Alabama. New York is scheduled to lose 2 congressional seats and perhaps more. But again, that's what the experts say. That's why we have a census. We're spending a lot of that $15 billion to try to prevent cyber attacks that would disrupt the technology that we're using to conduct the census. I bring this up because there have been a number of surveys that have been done to gauge how Americans feel about the census, and there's a growing number of Americans who say they're not going to participate in the census. Among those most likely to say they'll skip it, first category, young adults, 18 to 29 years old, about 34% when surveyed say they're not going to participate. African Americans, about 26%. Neighbors of ours with a family income of less than $30,000, about 24% say they're not going to participate. Hispanic Americans and Hispanics who are in our country but are not yet citizens, 21%. Look, I understand distrust of government. As bad as it looks sometimes from the outside, you should see it from the inside. But this is important, and I hope you will help us publicize the importance of all Americans, but including and especially Louisianians, to answer the census. We've made it as easy as possible this time. You can do it on the internet. You can do it by mail. If you don't choose to do it in one of those 2 ways, we'll probably have somebody from the government come see you. I hope you'll welcome him or her into your home and answer their questions. The second topic I want to talk about for just a few minutes is China. And of course, China is in the news because of our disagreements over trade and the tariffs. But that's not what I really want to talk about. I want to talk about the longer-term relationship with China. I think it would be fair to say that looking out over the next 25, 50, perhaps even 100 years, China is going to be America's biggest competitor. There's a lot of attention given to Russia, as there should be, but as a competitor, Russia's not even close to being in China's league. Russia has nuclear weapons and really good spies, but the Russian economy is actually smaller than the economy of New York State. It's not anywhere close to the size of the old USSR, Soviet Union economy. If you get outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow, about 40% of Russians struggle with having enough food and clothing on a daily basis. I've seen studies that show about 30% of male Russians die from alcohol-related illnesses. And among Russian males, their life expectancy is lower than that lower than that in North Korea. So while President Putin is a very shrewd tactician and, in my estimate, an amoral leader, it's through his talents that Russia's able to punch above its weight. Our real competition is going to be with China. When you compare the numbers, our economy is largest in the world and largest in the history of the world. But if you add up all the goods and services we produce every year, it's about $21 trillion. That's 12 zeros. The economy of China is second, about $14 trillion. We have about 327 million people. That's our best guess before the census. China has 1.4 billion people. Our per capita income in America is the largest in the world, about $63,000, $62,000 a year. China's is about 10. If you look at purchasing power parity, China's per capita income will double to about 20,000, but it's still substantially behind that in the United States. The competition that we're going to have with China in terms of military competition, I'm not going to talk economic, is going to be much, much different than the competition we had with the old Soviet Union. It's going to be more complex and probably, hopefully I'm wrong, but it may be more dangerous. The competition we had with the old USSR was basically nuclear weapons. And we had a Cold War, as you well know. We were able to keep the Cold War cold because of the prospect of mutual destruction. And it was the balance of terror, if you will. And we spent an enormous amount of time, and I give credit to both our country and to the former Soviet Union, we spent an enormous amount of our time on arms control. How do we try to contain this? Our competition, military competition with China is going to be different for two reasons. Number one, China's a much wealthier country than the old Soviet Union ever was, and much more diversified, and diversifying every day. Now, as a side note, everything is not perfect in China. Its growth is slowing, and it will slow even further. I think even if the tariffs come off, I think the days of 7% growth for our friends in China are just no more. I think likely this year, Chinese growth will be below 6%. If you look out, the people who have studied the issue, if you look out into the future, they're expecting growth to stabilize in the year 2030 at about 4%. China's also losing population. Their demographics they're getting older, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was the one-child policy. Part of it was is the fact that as people get wealthier, for whatever reason, they tend to have fewer children. By the year 2027, China's population will actually start to decline. The other thing that has hurt China immensely, in my opinion, China's great growth came when it adopted more of a free enterprise system and emphasized private companies in the private sector. That has changed under Xi Jinping. Now the major emphasis in China is not on private sector companies, it's on state-owned enterprises. China has a debt problem, and part of it is because they've thrown good money after bad into their state-owned industries. That has dramatically hurt productivity in the country. But having said all that, China is still going to be a formidable foe. The other reason that the new Cold War, if you will, with China is going to be different is because of technology. Now, I'm not saying that nuclear weapons and kinetic warfare won't play a part, but technology and cyber weapons have changed the world. They're cheap. They're in a more limited but still very effective way. They can destroy a country. With the right cyber weapons, you can crash power grids, you can shut down transportation systems, you can paralyze financial systems, you can shut down governments, you can shut down hospitals. And it's hard to know where the attacks are coming from. You can generally tell where a nuclear missile's coming from, but with a cyber attack, you often don't know. And China often uses proxies. It's also harder to retaliate because, number one, you you don't always know where the attack is coming from, so you're hesitant in that regard. If you don't respond, you lose the deterrent effect. If you overreact and respond too aggressively, you run the risk of escalation. The other thing that's going to be very difficult for us, it seems to me, is arms control, if you will. With the old USSR, we continuously negotiated together to try to prevent mutual destruction. When we reach an agreement, it's fairly easy to verify. You remember President Reagan talked about trust but verify. You can actually see a nuclear weapon. Cyber warfare is different. You can confect an agreement, but it's hard to enforce it. The other thing that makes it very difficult is that technology is changing so fast that what you deter today, or what you agree not to allow happen today with one of your adversaries, can be antiquated within a matter of 2 weeks. So I think what you're going to see in the federal budget, at least in America, we're seeing it now in China and other countries for that matter, we're going to be spending an enormous amount of money on research and development. And I guess the good news out of all this, if there is good news, is that a lot of the research and development in terms of technology that can help us deter cyber terrorism can also be put to uses that will make our economy more prosperous. That wasn't the case in the Cold War. Generally, if you built a nuclear weapon, I guess you added to your economic growth through the materials and the labor that went into that weapon, but it oftentimes came at the expense of something else that was important to your economy domestically. When you develop technology, it has uses in terms of cyber warfare, but it also can have peaceful uses that can grow your economy as well. The last topic I want to talk about, and then I'll take questions. How am I doing, Michelle? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about impeachment. Let me talk first about the process. In my judgment, it's, well, let me start this way. I don't think any fair-minded person believes that Speaker Pelosi or Chairman Schiff are impartial. Speaker Pelosi is directing this effort. I know Chairman Schiff has been the chairman of the committee selected to do the heavy lifting, but if you turn the speaker upside down and shake her, Adam falls out of her pocket. He is not calling these shots. The speaker is. It's been a very unfair process. The original proceedings were held in secret. Questioning was limited. The minority, which happens to be the Republicans, were not allowed access to the transcripts. And the whole purpose of that was to try to shape the narrative. I don't know whether it was the chairman or the speaker or their surrogates, but every day they would leak selectively portions of the transcript that they thought advanced their cause to friendly members of the media, who would lap it up like a puppy and print it in an effort to try to sway the narrative in public opinion. The president was not allowed to participate, nor was his counsel. They're moving into a second phase now, where they say they're going to have public testimony. Republicans can call witnesses, but only with Speaker Pelosi's permission. Actually, it's the Chairman Schiff's permission, but it'll be Speaker Pelosi's call. And I don't expect the Speaker to allow the Republicans to call any of their witnesses, or at least any of their important witnesses. Of course, they want to, they meaning the Republicans, want to call the whistleblower. My feeling about that is we ought to follow the law on the whistleblower, which
I've heard different versions of it. I haven't stopped to independently research it, but in terms of the whistleblower, I think we ought to follow the law. But the Republicans would like to call Mr. Hunter Biden. The Republicans, one of their witnesses is a member, I don't know if she's still a member, but she was a consultant for the Democratic National Committee that lobbied the Ukrainian embassy in the United States during the 2016 election to get involved in the election for president, or rather for Secretary of State Clinton. And there are a number of other witnesses. And I just think it's unfair when you don't afford, regardless of what you think about the defendant, when you don't afford him or her due process. I think what the Speaker is doing is very dangerous. This will be the first partisan impeachment in the history of our country. And I worry that it is going to elevate partisan impeachments to a new normal. We'll have a new president someday. We'll have a Democratic president someday. Our country is pretty divided, I think. You have the well-intentioned crazies on each end, but in the middle, you have, where I think most Americans are, you have about half of them are center-right and half of them are center-left, and that's why our presidential elections are so close. I worry that when we have a new Democratic president, whomever he or she is, that the roughly half of Americans who are disappointed that their candidate didn't win will demand us in Washington, as soon as the new Democratic president does something that those disappointed in the election disagree with, that they're going to demand that we impeach him or her. And they'll say, look, you did it to Trump. And I just don't want to see our democracy go there. So I think on process-wise, this is a huge mistake, particularly when you have an election in about 12 months. In terms of the substance, I will tell you, all I can tell you is how I analyze the case. Speaker Pelosi's entire case is based on Trump's assumed political motivation. And let me explain what you mean by that. There's a lot of attention that has been given to quid pro quo. I think it's a red herring. It only matters if they're talking about making a distinction rather between a legal quid pro quo and an illegal quid pro quo, and they never do that. So just because there's a quid pro quo, to me, it doesn't tell you anything. What matters is whether it's legal or illegal. Here's how I analyze the case. There are two possible scenarios. Number one, first scenario advanced by Speaker Pelosi is that the president asked for an investigation of a political rival. The second investigation, which Speaker Pelosi refuses to allow the House Republicans to offer testimony with respect to, the second scenario is that the president asked for an investigation of possible corruption by someone who happens to be a political rival. And there is a big difference. The latter would be in the national interest. The former would be in the president's self-interest. So I think this case is going, if it's properly analyzed, and this is just my opinion, is going to come down to motive. It's going to come down to motivation. It's going to come down to intent. The lawyers might call it mens rea. Whether the president had a good faith basis for believing in the possible corruption. So for me, there are only two questions that need to be answered, and they're both inextricably linked. The first is, why did the president ask for an investigation? And the second is, what did Mr. Hunter Biden do for the money? And I don't think that you can resolve this in a fair way until you answer both of those questions. And one of the
serious problems I have with my Democratic friends in the House and Speaker Pelosi is that she refuses to allow the Republicans to call witnesses with respect to the allegations against Mr. Biden and his father. And indeed, she refuses to allow the Republicans to call in any witnesses, and I think that's doubling down on stupid. What counts here is what the American people think, and the American people cannot assess the veracity of a witness if they can't see the witness, if it's all done behind closed doors. And you know, democracy does die in darkness. I read that somewhere, and I believe it. So anyway, those are my thoughts today. Thanks again to our veterans. God bless each and every one of them. And I wore my LSU tie today too. Yes, sir.
Aren't the committee hearings now going to be in public? And don't grand juries do things in secret? And if you've got a murderer, you've got somebody that's dead.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got a police officer that shot someone in the line of duty, it's not a murder. That's the difference between, isn't that the difference between an illegal quid pro quo and a non-illegal one? I mean, didn't President Trump ask for only one investigation of one person, not a corruption investigation? So aren't there significant differences in the way you represented this and what we're gonna see in the public in the future? And so if we took the police chief,
Mhm.
shook him upside down, in the detective that's investigating the murder gonna fall out? And is that a problem that the chief of police is boss?
Well, obviously, I just stated what I believe, so I don't agree with you. This is not a grand jury hearing. This is the impeachment of the President of the United States. I realize that the President is not nature's best diplomat. I think about half of the American people like him, about half don't. I don't think that's especially unusual in these day and times. But I don't think any president ought to be impeached on the basis of pure politics. And in my opinion, that's what's going on here. I think everybody on Capitol Hill knows it. But, you know, if you disagree, I understand. That's why. I mean, well, if I just finish my thought, this is America. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. That's what's great about our country.
I have a follow-up.
Yes, ma'am.
Repeat the question also?
I'm sorry?
Repeat the question?
I couldn't repeat that one. It was too long.
This is why I'm asking.
Let this gentleman do a follow-up, and then I'll get you, ma'am.
The information that has come out seems to have been accurate, while the information Donald Trump has provided seems to be changing on a moment-to-moment basis. So, you say this is your opinion. I respect it's an opinion, not necessarily based on facts. That's why the news media has been putting out information, and none of it seems to have been recanted or recalled.
Right.
Donald Trump's information has been recalled and recalled and recalled.
I understand how you feel.
So what's the question?
I don't know. Yes, sir.
If the president's mindset is so important to impeachment and his motivation is so important, then how can Hunter Biden speak to that? How can he speak to the president?
He can't. He can speak to whatever happened in Ukraine and whether the president had a good faith basis for asking for the investigation. Here's what we know. Ukrainian government, not the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian government is historically and organically corrupt. I think that's a fact. I hope that President Zelensky does better. Number two, President Obama put Vice President Biden in charge of the foreign affairs of two countries, China and Ukraine. And Mr. Hunter Biden walked away with
extraordinarily lucrative contracts in both countries. Number three, and this is, I won't state this as a fact, maybe it's just I happen to believe it. I don't think that Mr. Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, got Mr. Hunter Biden's name off ZipRecruiter. Okay? And if you have a president, and again, I'm going back to my two scenarios. If you have a president that says, I've got $400 million of American taxpayer money, and I don't want to see it stolen or wasted in a politically corrupt country, then, and I'm entitled to ask that certain allegations with respect to corruption be investigated, I think you can marshal a very persuasive argument that that's not inappropriate. We've had instances, I'll give you two, where presidents have investigated their political rivals. Thomas Jefferson investigated Aaron Burr. Not only investigated him, he had him tried for treason. He thought that former Vice President Burr was trying to conspire with the British to take part of our Western territory and form a new country. And Burr and Jefferson were bitter political rivals. In fact, they tied for the presidency. I believe the tie had to be broken by Congress. Now, Vice President Burr was acquitted, but I think there was credible evidence that he was doing it. The second instance is a more recent instance. I don't remember the year. It had to be the early 70s, maybe late 60s. But President Johnson had decided not to run for president, as you may recall. And his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was running against Richard Nixon, then a private citizen, former vice president. And there were allegations that former Vice President Nixon was trying to interfere in the Paris peace talks to solve the war in Vietnam. There were great demands on President Johnson to have former Vice President Nixon investigated, a political rival. But he couldn't do it because allegedly he gained the information about Nixon through illegal wiretaps. And so he was worried that if he had asked for an investigation, he would also have to explain where he got the information. Yes, sir.
To be there for, I guess it's 2-3 years.
I'm sorry. I'll get you next. I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
To be there 2 to 3 years, why can't either party control spending in Washington?
Yeah.
What's the question?
Why can't either party control spending in Washington? I've been there about 3 years, a little less. It's gotten worse every day, not just in terms of the spending. I don't hate anybody. I don't know all the members of the House, but I know all my fellow senators. Now, I may disagree with you and speak very plainly when I do, but the amount of hate and vitriol is just, it's one of my biggest surprises. It is bled over in part to our spending. But I don't want to blame it all on the vitriol. The short answer to your question is lack of will. We have a $22 trillion, that's 12 zeros, dollar debt. We have a budget of about $4.5 trillion a year. Problem is we spend about 5.4. There is no will that I can see on either side of the aisle. I voted against the last, before we do a budget, we agree on the amount we're going to spend. A rational person would start first with how much money do you have, but that's not the way they do it in Washington.
And the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership and the president agreed on what we call a top line number. And I voted against it because they made no effort whatsoever to try to save any money. The Office of Management and Budget every year sends us over suggestions as ways to save money, and some of them are a little off the wall, but a lot of them really would work. So I voted against that. But I found very quickly that in Washington, D.C., everybody talks about reducing spending, but it's like going to heaven. You know, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody's ready just yet to make the trip. And that's the way it is there. I sit on appropriations. My first appropriations meeting, we had just cut taxes. And until the growth kicked in, we knew that our deficits were going to be higher. And by the way, the tax cut worked. I mean, our income is way up. The problem is our spending is up even higher. But I offered an amendment to the appropriations bill. I'm in front of the appropriations committee. There are like 35 members. It's the biggest committee in Congress. They put in the budget, I think it was a 2.9%, don't hold me to that number, pay raise for all federal employees. And our federal employees are pretty well paid. They're paid better than the private sector. And I can show you the GAO study that shows that. And I said, you know, we just cut taxes, and until the growth kicks in, we're going to be running deficits. Maybe we ought to postpone that this year. And I offered an amendment. I got 2 votes, myself and Cindy Hyde-Smith, the senator from Mississippi. And I looked at my Republican. I expected my Democratic friends to vote against it, but I looked at all my Republicans, and they all of a sudden had to look at an email on their iPhone. And that's when I knew. I said, this is just play acting, and I'm very disappointed in that. Yes, sir.
Senator, thanks. A year ago, net neutrality and internet privacy were huge.
Hey, Randy, I didn't recognize you, man.
And they're very important issues to you.
Net neutrality, you said?
Neutrality and internet privacy.
Yeah.
And I know they're very important to you, but those issues seem to have gone away. What's going on with them?
Well, let me take the net neutrality first. The FCC rolled back so-called net neutrality. There was an effort in Congress to unroll it back, if that makes sense, and to restore net neutrality. Most Democrats, I think maybe all Democrats, voted to restore net neutrality. Joe Manchin might have voted the other way. I don't remember. But it was most of my Democratic colleagues. And most of the Republicans in the Senate voted against net neutrality. I voted for it. I spent the Congressional Research Service does a lot of research, and they're just unbelievable. I mean, they're just unbelievable. They can develop any kind of report you want, and they can write it in a way that you can understand it, and it's thorough, and they're not political. They're just great. And I met with the CRS people a bunch of times trying to understand the pros and the cons. And there are some good pros and cons. But I finally voted to support net neutrality for this reason. Someday we'll have 5G, and then everybody will have 5G, including rural areas, and then you'll have a level playing field. And all the providers of wireless will have to compete with the providers of cable and everything else. But until that day comes, I don't completely trust my cable company. And if you're living in Dry Prong, Louisiana, and you have access to one cable provider, and that I'm not saying that I don't know who the cable provider is there, so I'm not making this allegation. Well, in fact, strike it. If you're in a rural area, let's don't personalize it. If you're in a rural area and you have one cable provider, and that cable provider comes to you and says, if you don't pay me more, I'm going to have to slow down your internet. I just don't have a choice. I don't think that's fair. And so I voted against it. Took a lot of heat. Someday, we won't need net neutrality, but that day is not here yet. In terms of privacy, look, everybody, the privacy is the easy solution. I mean, we know the drill. Nobody ever expected Facebook to be this big, or Google. And the deal on Facebook is, first, it's a free country, and it's a free service. And the bargain you make is, you give up all this information about yourself in return for the right to see what your high school friend had for dinner Saturday night. And some people think that's an okay trade, and this is America. And if you know what you're giving up, and the consent is willful and knowing, I got no problem with it, but it's not. If you go look at Facebook's user agreement, it's like 7 or 8 single-space pages. You could hide a dead body in there, and nobody'd ever find it. You can't understand it. And what we need to do is say, okay, here's the deal. You got to tell people the truth. You got to write it in plain English. You got to give people the right to consent and then unconsent. It's really a license agreement. You got to let people have access to the personal data. You got to have allow people to move their personal data. That'll enhance competition. It's not complicated. And why doesn't it happen? I don't know. You know, our committee chairman in the House and the Senate just won't take up the bill. And that's been another one of my big disappointments. I was sent up there to debate and decide. And the tough part with the internet is we can all agree that poison is being spread on the internet. But here's the tough part. What's poison? And who gets to decide what poison is? That's the tough one. But so far, I told them the other day, my colleagues we meet for lunch 3 times a week, the Republican senators do, and I told them I'm not going to any more hearings on privacy on the internet. Because all we do is strut around, issue press releases, hold hearings, and do nothing. And there's several bills. All that they have to do is bring them up and let us vote. That's where I am.
Tell us about the president's visit to Louisiana this week.
Well, he was here last Thursday, of course. They tell me I talked to the gentleman on the political side at the White House who handles all this stuff Saturday, in fact. And I think they're going to follow the same format for Thursday. We'll leave Washington probably, I don't know, 3:30 with the time change. I think don't hold me to this, but I think the rally starts at 7 o'clock. The president will start speaking at 7, and he'll finish whenever he finishes. He has a teleprompter. Sometimes he follows it, and sometimes he doesn't. I've been to a couple of these. It's hard to plan your evening because he looks like he's just about to land the plane, you know, and he touches down and he heads up again into another subject. The people love it, at least those who agree with him. They had 47,000 applications online for 10,000 seats in Monroe. And I think, I mean, I'll offer you this point of view, and then I got to go to Alexandria. I'm sorry. I don't think this is a news flash to say that there's a lot of anger in our country. And I think the genesis of that anger is that we have too many Americans who aren't participating in the great wealth of this country. Economically, but not just economically, socially, culturally. And they feel left out. There are many of those people are on the so-called right. Many of those people are on the so-called left. I don't know how this election will pan out, but I always, looking back at the 2016 election,
the two candidates who had the most passionate supporters were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And their supporters, even though they disagreed on many issues, had more in common than they didn't in terms of their anger. I think Donald Trump got elected, in my opinion, for two reasons. Number one, he never talked down to people, and he still doesn't today. Now, you might like or dislike the way he talks, but he doesn't condescend, doesn't talk down to people. And number two, I think clearly he was elected as an insult to what I call the managerial elite, primarily focused on Washington, D.C., but not exclusively. When I say the managerial elite, and I'm painting with a broad brush here, but the entrenched politicians, many academics, many bureaucrats, many journalists, many corporate phonies. And this group of people, at least as perceived by President Trump's base, this group of people, I call them the cultured, cosmopolitan, goat's milk latte drinking, avocado toast eating elite. They think they're smarter and more virtuous than the American people, or at least a big chunk of the American people. You know, I remember when a presidential candidate mocked people for believing in God in the Second Amendment. I remember when a presidential candidate, in a very rare moment of candor, talked about people being deplorables. Trump doesn't mock people for believing in God or believing in the Second Amendment or serving in the military or trying to teach their kids morals. And I think that is the genesis of a lot of his power. But I'm obviously, that's one point of view. But if you'll think about it, I think you will see that, I don't know about this time, but in 2016, a lot of Bernie's people and their passion at being left out of America was shared with a lot of the people that were supporting Trump. And we've got to do something about that. I don't know yet exactly what, but it's more than economic. I'll give you, this is more than you wanted, but I'll give you another example. You know, for the last 30 years in America, we have emphasized economic growth, growing the economy. And it's worked. Our GDP is 3 times larger than it was in 1975. And the idea has been a rising tide lifts all ships. And if you grow the pie, everybody's slice is bigger. That doesn't mean all slices are the same. And some people get left behind, but we take care of them by redistribution. Medicare, Medicaid, well, not really Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, earned income tax credit. So there's this idea that we grow the economy at any cost, and people who are left behind, we have social programs. The problem with that is, for a lot of Americans, yeah, they got a cell phone, but they're also on food stamps. And they don't have, these are many low-income high school graduates. They don't have a job, or they don't have a meaningful job. They can't support their family. They can't contribute to their community. The rates of suicide and drug abuse and depression are through the roof. And yeah, from a standpoint of consumption, yeah, their quality of life's probably better, but they're not productive. And one school of thought, and I'm not completely convinced, but I'm getting there, is that we need to emphasize consumption less and productivity more. Because I don't care how many cell phones you have or what kind of car you drive, if you don't feel part of the country and part of the community, and that you can't support your family and you don't feel good about yourself, you're not part of America. The American dream has always been built on the fact that the circumstances of your birth do not have to determine the outcome of your life. And I worry that we're losing that.